Hello, my name's Ian. I'm a researcher here at Wadham and I work on a big project funded by the AHRC about Franz Kafka. And I'm here with David, who is the co-literary executor of the Cecil Day Lewis estate. And the reason we're here today is to talk about one of the library's most recent acquisitions, which we have here. And this acquisition was made possible by a very generous donation of a former Sarah Lawrence student here at Wadham, Eric Strauss, for which we're very grateful. And this particular book is first English edition of Franz Kafka's novel, The Trial. And the interesting thing, particularly interesting thing about this copy, is that it was owned by Cecil Day Lewis, a former Wadham alumnus, and he was sent this copy in 1937 when it was first published by Gollancz. And David can perhaps tell us a little bit about what Cecil Day Lewis was doing in 1937 or in the 1930s more generally.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian. Just starting off, we're not quite clear as to whether he reviewed the book or not, are we? But we think not, because we can't find a review anywhere.
That's right. We think it was sent as a review copy, but I haven't been able to find a review by him of that novel.
So, it's interesting because this was just the time when Day Lewis was basically freelancing. So he was doing a lot of magazine, a lot of journal work, a lot of journalistic work. He was surviving also on a new project, but surviving to some extent on a new project, was writing crime detective fiction. But he was really keeping his literary hand in with a lot of reviewing. By this stage, he was living in Cheltenham, just outside Cheltenham, in a beautiful little cottage called Box Cottage, with his wife Mary King, his first wife, and their two young boys, Sean and Nicholas. And the point being that he had a young family to look after, so money was quite tight, particularly by 1937, because he'd lost his, well, they hadn't lost his job, he left Cheltenham College where he was teaching. And he rather to his relief, he had left, because only by leaving could he join the Communist Party, which he'd always been keen to do. But when you're teaching in a public school, particularly in the junior section of a public school, being a member of the Communist Party is a bit of a no-no, particularly that period. So he actually suffered the last period at Cheltenham. Really, how he managed, I don't know quite, because he was constantly the Board of Governors were constantly encouraging him to come to talk to them about why he was involved in left-wing pursuits and why he was writing left-wing poetry, although they weren't quite so bothered by the poetry, because as he said in his autobiography, nobody seemed to read the poetry anyway, all seemed to be much bothered by it. They were much more bothered by the fact that he was writing detective fiction, which they regarded as smutty. So the Question of Proof, which was a book that unfortunately was set in an English public school. There was a liaison between a young master and the headmaster's wife, and the governors thought that this was autobiographical. So of course they were very, very concerned that this was all about Cheltenham College. And the headmaster, who was a good friend of Day Lewis's, didn't mind, and he and his wife had a great sense of humour. But the governors didn't have a sense of humour, particularly Lord Lee of Fareham, who was not happy with Day Lewis in general. So essentially, what we're seeing by 1937 is a man who's surviving entirely. He'd left the college actually in late 1935. So this was his second year of surviving on his on his wits, really.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's really helpful to kind of contextualize the time and place in which he would have been encountering this novel by Kafka. The reason it came to our attention here at Wadham last year, this particular edition, is quite a convoluted story that I'll try and reconstruct. Almost a year ago, the librarian at Wadham, Tim, came to me and told me that he'd seen Cecil Day-Lewis's own copy of Kafka's novel The Trial up for sale, and would we be interested in purchasing this for the college, given that last year, 2024, was the centenary year of Kafka's death. So we were very keen to acquire this quite unique copy, and that then set off a chain of various discoveries, not least because Cecil Day-Lewis is generally regarded in scholarship to be one of the earliest, if not the earliest, writers to use the adjective Kafka-esque, which is a very often used, perhaps overused adjective. So I was particularly curious once this book came into the college to read this review myself. It rang a bell for me, having worked recently on a book by Brian Goodman called The Nonconformists, which we also have in the library, in which he cites a book review, since you mentioned left-wing publications, in an American Marxist journal from 1938. Day-Lewis reviews a novel by Edward Upward, Journey to the Border, which we also have here. And he describes that novel as Kafka-esque, though I'd not read the review myself, and so I was interested in seeing not just that he uses the word, but how does he use the word? What does he use it to mean? And as it happens on Kafka's birthday, the 3rd of July, I was going through London and decided to drop in at the British Library, call up the review by Day-Lewis from 1938 of Journey to the Border to read and see how he's using this adjective. And in one of those sort of unpredictable moments that you sometimes are lucky to have when you're digging through archives, you find the thing you're looking for, and then you find something that you're not expecting to find. And what I found in that folder that I wasn't expecting to find was tucked behind the review from 1938, another review from 1936, which was of an anthology called New Writing, in which an extract from Upward's novel appears as a sort of work in progress, so a year before it's published. And in the review of this anthology that's also written, the review is also written by Cecil Day-Lewis, he also uses the word Kafka-esque to describe Upward's writing. So I had this very exciting moment of realizing that I'd found, as far as I knew, an earlier usage of the word Kafka-esque than we'd been aware of, that we'd come across before. So that's one thing. But perhaps the even more exciting discovery, as we'll see when we have a look at the review itself, which we've acquired a copy of over there, was the fact that Cecil Day-Lewis uses the term Kafka-esque to discuss Upward's originality as a writer and his humour. And if we think back now a century since Kafka's death, those are very different qualities than many of the sort of stereotypes and cliches about the Kafka-esque that we might normally think of. Oppression by forces unknown, helplessness in the face of bureaucracy, repetition, dullness, struggle. All of these things have been in many ways consolidated over the last century as cliches or stereotypes of Kafka's writing. But when Day-Lewis is using this adjective Kafka-esque to describe another writer's work, he's looking at very different aspects of the writing, the originality, as I say, and the humour of that work. So is that something you think that would have resonated Cecil Day-Lewis's own writing, this originality and particularly the question of humour as well.
I think so, and particularly in some of his detective fiction, some of the poetry as well. But also he was a very funny man, and just to bring the story back to Wadham, thinking about his time here, his important friendships, particularly with Rex Warner and Charles Fundy, and they shared a house just up the road in St Giles. A lot of it is about the fact that they had a very enjoyable time together, and they must have been very funny, particularly because they had Morris Bower as their tutor. Morris Bower was Cecil's personal tutor, and he was extremely funny, and as we all know at Wadham, very indiscreet. But he had the most remarkable effect on his students because he was so enthusiastic, and introduced his students to a wonderful wealth of literature, which they might never otherwise come into contact with. But he was also a great thinker and very aware of modern developments. So I think this helped to set the scene for Day-Lewis as quite a left-wing thinker, but also he was brought up in Edwinstowe in Nottinghamshire, where his father was the cleric. He was the priest at the church. I'm trying to remember now whether he was a rector or a vicar, but it doesn't matter. And that's Edwinstowe is in Sherwood Forest, and it's a mining area. And as Jill once said to me, Cecil's wife, Cecil never forgot the miners throughout his life. The difficulties of being, a working class grafter, if you like, and the economic problems that they underwent. So I think in the context of what we're talking about, he would have a natural empathy for writers like Kafka in any case, because he was interested in progressive writing, and his manifesto that he published in 1934, A Hope for Poetry, which is essentially a manifesto about the new poetry, namely himself, Auden and Spender, and then in a later edition he brought in Macnish into this equation too. This was a manifesto about progressive poetry that was about modern life in this country and the problems of modern life, the international problems of having just had a First World War and the ominous temperature in Europe, anxiety about a possible another war in the future, and that's how he felt poetry should be placed. So yes, he was very interested in other writers in other countries who were tackling some of the same issues.
It's interesting, as you say as well, the proximity of war to the writing. And the Trial in English is published in 1937, so just before the outbreak of the Second World War, but it's in fact written by Kafka just before the outbreak of the First World War as well. So that sort of realignment, political and social realignment that was just about to happen is perhaps there under the surface in the in the work itself.
One thing that did come up, which was something that other people watching this might wonder about, was did Day-Lewis read German? And to the best of our knowledge, and I've asked the family, including his son Nicholas, who lives in Australia, and nobody seems to think that he certainly didn't speak German, but whether he ever used a crib. But he'd probably only be using a crib for translation, and he didn't translate anything. Yeah. So.
Yes, that is a particularly interesting aspect to this whole story, this whole case, if you like. Thinking back past the kind of stereotypes and cliches of Kafka and Kafka's writing that have developed over the past century, to reimagine almost what it was like to be reading only a small amount of Kafka that was available in English translation if Deleuze isn't reading him in German. At the time in 1936, the only stories of Kafka's that are available in English translation, to the best of my knowledge, are the novel The Castle, which is published in 1930, a short story collection of posthumously published short stories called The Great Wall of China that comes out in 1933. And that's a far more eclectic, strange group of stories. So perhaps that's exerting a particular influence over Deleuze's sense of what Kafka's writing is like. And before those, a couple of stories published in newspapers in the 20s. But a far smaller body of work, and this was for me also quite an exciting discovery in this whole process, having been inspired to go hunting for these snippets by this copy of The Trial, to realise that Deleuze is using the term Kafka-esque in English before The Trial is available in English translation. So the novel that in many ways, perhaps also under the influence of Orson Welles' 1960s film of The Trial, this is really consolidating those images and ideas that we have of what the Kafka-esque means. He's using this term Kafka-esque to describe someone's writing before any of that exists in English.
When we were talking about, when we've been talking about this before, I think we were sort of wondering about how broadly people would be aware of, that these, where he uses the word Kafka-esque, they're quite brief sentences, brief, paragraphs where he touches on this phrase that he's using. And there's a sort of an assumption that his audience is going to know what he's talking about, which is interesting because given the availability of or the limited availability of Kafka.
Yes.
In that early period.
Absolutely, yes. So my suspicion, currently unfounded until I go digging around or somebody else goes digging around in the library and finds any further references, is that this early reference from 1936 to the word Kafka-esque, or this early usage of the word Kafka-esque, is likely not the first, because Deleuze doesn't explain what he means by Kafka-esque. He's writing this review in the Listener magazine, the BBC's Listener magazine, so he's writing for a general reading public. There is an assumption that people will know who he means, will know what he means when he describes Kafka-esque. And he draws attention, as I say, to the humour, to the originality. But there is an assumption, I think, that this is a writer you'll be aware of. So I have wondered whether in earlier reviews, earlier articles, either by Deleuze or perhaps another writer, there may be earlier usages of this adjective. It's certainly much earlier, this usage, and the 1938 usage that Brian Goodman mentions in his book is earlier than what had generally been acknowledged until last year or early this year. The earliest reference made in the Oxford English Dictionary, for example, was to an article from 1947 in the New Yorker. So we're going back much earlier than that. And that's fascinating to see just how early this adjective Kafka-esque is being used in the English language, but not only that it's being used, but what it's being used to communicate to readers.
I still come back, think back not only to Auden, but also to Spender, because he not only did Auden spend that period in Berlin, but also Spender, and given how much contact Deleuze had with both of them, I still wonder whether that's the missing link, and it is something that possibly came out in correspondence, even not necessarily published then. Not necessarily in an article, but something that might have come through in letters between these people. That's a possibility. I did moot this idea that Auden might have been a source with Edward Mendelssohn, his executor. But he didn't. It was in an email, and he didn't respond to that particular part of the email. He didn't sort of jump on this and say, "Oh, it's definitely Auden." He just didn't. He didn't respond, and he knows Auden like the back of his hand. So, it's a bit of a mystery. Perhaps that's what we're talking about now, or being people out of the woodwork who might know a bit more than we do about the possible original source.
I suppose one other question that this raises is the use of authors' surnames as adjectives and the extent to which they are both very capacious adjectives. They can mean an awful lot, but at the same time they become quite reductive shorthands and also limit potentially what they're referring to.
It certainly doesn't allow for two meanings for a start. I mean, Kafka, no one is, if you use the word Kafka-esque, people don't want to have two meanings. They want the meaning they know about. So.
Yes, or it becomes this sort of euphemistic sense where you don't have to explain what you mean. You can just say the adjective and you know what I mean when I say Kafka-esque. Interestingly, as we get sort of a bit further on into the 1960s, it seems to touch a nerve with Edward Upward himself. We found a letter from 1962, coincidentally, I think the same year that Orson Welles' film of the trial comes out, in which he objects to Day-Lewis's usage of the adjective Kafka-esque to describe his own work. But of course, what we need to remember there is several decades have elapsed since Day-Lewis used that term. And it seems, reading the letter, what Upward is particularly objecting to is the more contemporary, at that time, during the Cold War, for instance, the usage of the term Kafka-esque. And that isn't really what he's trying to do at all. If I remember rightly in the letter, one of the aspects that he's keen to sort of differentiate himself from is some quest for higher meaning or search for greater significance, struggling against all odds, which actually also is an aspect of Kafka's work that was very much pushed by his friend and editor Max Brod when he brought out the very, very heavily edited versions of these of Kafka's novels, all of which were unfinished by Kafka but made to look like finished works when they were first published. And this reading is one that was particularly pushed by Max Brod. And so it's interesting to see how, even over a few decades, that word Kafka-esque has accrued certain resonances that then Upward himself, looking back, decides that he wants to distinguish his own work from.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? It just shows you how fluid these phrases are.
Absolutely.
And when we've talked about this in previous conversations, we were thinking about, again, these phrases are handy, but they're simplistic. So Shakespearean or Orwellian. Yeah. There's a long list. Yeah. Although I haven't come across Austen-esque yet. I don't know what we do about Jane Austen.
There's still time.
Still time.
There is something to that variety, though, in terms of what the word Kafka-esque signifies, that for me was a reminder to look back at the variety of writing that Kafka himself actually produced. That he's not a sort of easily boxed in writer, one size fits all, does exactly what he says on the tin. He's a writer who constantly surprises you. Anytime he gives you one perspective on something, he'll switch around and give you a new perspective on it. He's very, very diverse in terms of what he's writing about, and particularly that early posthumous collection of short stories I mentioned, The Building of the Great Wall of China, or just the Great Wall of China, I think it was when it was first published. He's writing all different perspectives. He's writing about what it's like to be a bridge. He's writing about what it's like to be some mysterious burrowing underground creature. It's a huge variety of different stories, and it's a good, if anything, it's a good reminder finding this review by Cecil Day-Lewis to go back and look at that originality and that humour and also that variety in Kafka's fiction, rather than just seeing him as this kind of monolithic writer that only writes about the individual's struggle against a higher authority.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to him than that, which Day-Lewis was clearly picking up on very, very early on.
Yeah. Yeah. It's it just reminds me of what you were just saying about Kafka. Reminds me of going back to George Orwell and that Orwellian phrase, where people just think of, that Orwellian means 1984, but of course he was actually also a very amusing writer, and very caustic, but very sharp, but also he could be quite funny.
Yes.
But people just think about, if they use the word Orwellian, they're not thinking about the more nuanced side of him as a writer any more than this phrase Kafka-esque. Really, it doesn't even begin to cover Kafka as a writer and his range.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that question of range is key. Yeah, as you say with Orwell, if you use the term Orwellian, you're usually referring to Animal Farm, 1984, and choosing to ignore the earlier social novels.
Well, in his travel logs,
It's travel writing as well, that's true. I suppose using any author's surname in that adjectival way does necessitate making choices about what you're referring to and what you're not. But I'm very glad to have found this review by Day-Lewis that reminds us to look at other aspects of the writer's life, not just the dominant cliches and stereotypes that remain.
Going back to just what I should have said earlier, really, in terms of Day-Lewis's humour. When I contacted the family about it, and the context in which he was using the phrase Kafka, they said, that's the Cecil we knew. He would have appreciated Upwood's humour in the context of that novel, Journey to the Border, which is what he was writing about, reviewing. So, if nothing else, your research, this great paper trail, this great detective story, which in a way you're still involved in, because it hasn't ended really, has it? has brought to, has reminded us, certainly reminded me of the fact that this phrase can mean many things. Certainly much more than, the endless corridors of power and corruption that people think about.
Right. So if we take a closer look then at the copy of the trial that Cecil Day-Lewis himself owned, we can see that it's actually in remarkably good condition. And if we open it inside, you can see his signature here.
Very expressive, I think.
Very expressive signature here, made in pencil. And the title page here, naming the translators, Willer and Edwin Muir, some of the earliest translators of Kafka into English, published by Victor Gollancz in 1937.
Notice on the spine, smoker's grime, or whatever you call it. I mean, that book has been in many libraries. I mean, Cecil's library, but they moved so many times. So it started life in Cheltenham, or just outside Cheltenham, and then it moved down to Devon when he moved to a place called Musbury. The house was called Brim Close. And then after that, eventually, of course, he ended up living in London. But he had a slightly peripatetic existence in the sense that his life became emotionally more and more complicated by the war, and eventually he'd separated from Mary Day-Lewis, his first wife. This was via a long relationship with Rosamund Lehman. In fact, when he was with Rosamund, he at one stage in his life he was dividing his time between Brim Close and his wife Mary, and his lover, his mistress, Rosamund Lehman, who lived by that stage. Do I mean Long Whittenham or Little Whittenham? But anyway, Whittenham Clumps near Dorchester. he was living there in one of the Wittenhams on the river, near the River Thames. But that would still have been living in Brim Close in Devon at that stage, I think. But his life became quite confusing in terms of the way he was writing. And eventually he would settle down in 1951 with his second wife, Jill Borken, the actress. And then his last 21 years was relatively stable.
I mean, this is the thing that the Mures are quite criticised for sometimes, the slight embellishment of Kafka's writing in English. So someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K. For without having done anything wrong, he was arrested one fine morning. It's just one morning in German. And they just have this tendency to embellish slightly. Jemand musste Josef K. verleumdet haben, denn ohne dass etwas Böses getan hätte, wurde eines Morgens verhaftet in German.
This is the trouble with translations, you see.
If you start adding stuff in. Yeah. But it's got its own kind of poetry, its own kind of style, or slightly melancholic, perhaps. But they do slightly embellish. So here we also have a very nice first edition of Edward Upward's novel Journey to the Border, which is the book that's under review by Day-Lewis in the 1938 review he wrote that uses the word Kafka-esque, and also an extract of which he was in the anthology that was under review in 1936 as well, also in very good condition. And interesting to note perhaps that it was published by Leonard and Virginia Woolf's Hogarth Press, in fact. So more and more of these connections to
indeed, because Leonard and Virginia Woolf were Day-Lewis's early publishers.
So, David, you've also brought some examples of C. Day-Lewis's publications that came out with the Hogarth Press that Leonard and Virginia Woolf owned.
Yes, that's right. I mean, this particularly attractive book with a nice cover by the artist John Banting. This was one of a series of books that Hogarth Press, in other words, Leonard and Virginia Woolf, they published a whole series of books in this format, including 3 by Day-Lewis. This particular book, apart from being quite an attractive item in itself, has an amusing story because Day-Lewis specifically refers to this book when he talks about his rather torrid time as a master at Cheltenham College. He refers to this book in his autobiography as a revolutionary book, which was full of left-wing power, as it were. But he said, as he said at the time, it didn't seem to bother the governors because he as he said, nobody seemed to really worry about poetry because nobody read it anyway. So that book didn't affect his reputation too badly in Cheltenham. What affected his reputation was his novel, this particular novel, Question of Proof, with its reference to his rather unfortunate reference, as it happened, to a master having an affair with the headmaster's wife. 1935, when he produced this book, A Time to Dance, this book, which was also published by Hogarth Press, did incredibly well. It went into reprint because by this stage, word had got round that Day-Lewis, this master in the junior school at Cheltenham College, had been declared by T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, as the one great man living in England. Lawrence was a great fan of Day-Lewis. They corresponded, T. Lawrence had already read A Hope for Poetry, which was Day-Lewis's manifesto book about the new poetry of the 30s. And Day-Lewis, declared Day-Lewis to be this great man when he was talking to Churchill, of all people. Now, this was overheard by journalists, and I think it was in was it an Evening Standard? It was in one of the papers that the story got reported. So, of course, nobody had heard of Day-Lewis, and I don't think anyone else had heard of Day-Lewis in the room at this party. But of course, it did a lot for his reputation. So this book became a bit of a bestseller almost overnight as a result of this. T. Lawrence doing his best for Day-Lewis in terms of promotion. That did very well. This book did really badly. This came in the year 1936, which was the first year that Day-Lewis was living off the immoral earnings of a journalist. As a journalist, it was the crucial year when he was doing as much journal work as he could, journalistic work, and also continuing to write detective fiction. But Noah and the Waters was a book that he tried very hard to forget because it absolutely plummeted. Nobody had a good word to say for it. Even his friends didn't like it. It's essentially a moral story about Noah and the flood. Noah contemplating the flood, and is he going to go with the flood? The flood being the new age, the revolution, how would one describe it? I mean, in a sense, it is a political book. I mean, the flood is really the communist, the new communism. He was free to write this book with this story because by this stage, having left Cheltenham College, he was free to join the Communist Party. So he joined in 1936, but he left the Communist Party, we think in 1940, although we don't have a precise date, but we think he left in 1940 because he was very upset by the way in which Stalin was treating the Finns. Stalin was sort of land grabbing in Finland at that stage, and it didn't go down at all well in the sort of broader communist community, shall we say. But yeah, it plummeted, this book. And in fact, when in his collected poems, I think he only included the prologue or the first section. Yes, he only included the prologue in his collected poems, and the rest he ditched because it just didn't work as a book.
And it's fascinating to hear that contextualization for this review that he writes in 1936 of this anthology of new writing. So he's writing this and he's engaging with this new writing at a low point, could we say, career-wise, where his most recent publication hasn't gone very well, but he's searching for something new. He's engaging with new writing very closely and looking further afield, not just to new writing in English, but also to works in translation as well. Another book we've got here, another first edition, in fact, is this anthology of new writing that was published by the Bodley Head. This anthology used to come out twice a year, as it says on this very nicely designed cover. This is the anthology in which an extract of Edward Upward's novel In Progress first appears. This is the anthology that Day-Lewis reviews in 1936, and describing this extract from an unpublished novel as Kafka-esque. And it's fascinating to see not only the extract by Edward Upward, which you have here entitled The Borderline from an Unpublished Novel, but it's fascinating for me also to see who else is included in this anthology. Some names we've already heard, Stephen Spender, for instance. Christopher Isherwood is published in here, but also other writers in translation. Anna Zegers, the exiled German writer, included in translation, and others. So Boris Pasternak, for instance. It's fascinating to see not only individual extracts from novels that Day-Lewis reviews and describes as Kafka-esque, or that one extract, but also really interesting, I think, is to look at what does it appear alongside, what other works is it in conversation with, if you like.
It's a lovely copy. That is the dust jacket is another condition. I mean, the interesting thing is John Lehrman, who actually edited that book, I believe.
That's right. New Writing, edited by John Lehrman.
Yeah.
Spring 1936.
And he was very important, wasn't he, as an editor and a publisher. And I know he was a good friend of Cecil's too.
That's another fascinating connection. Also worth noting, perhaps, that this is in fact the first ever issue or first ever edition of New Writing, which will be published twice every year. This is number 1. And perhaps another neat thing to notice about this 1936 issue of the Listener magazine, with the review by Cecil Day-Lewis of New Writing, is that a few pages on, if we look down to the bottom, we can in fact see a little advertisement for that very anthology. So it's always worth paying attention, I think, to not only individual pieces in these kind of periodicals, but also what they appear next to, what else is included in the magazine.
I mean, you can't escape the sort of the connections. You know, I mean, I was just down at St Giles looking for number 22 St Giles, and I couldn't find it. But I did find, of course, the Department of Statistics. And I just thought of, immediately thought of Kafka. I couldn't find Cecil's house that he shared, while he was here, but I could find the Department of Statistics. So it goes on.
Yeah.